to obey God, so that they can cease to be these self-destructive servants of sin that they would be if they had not learned to obey their authorities, beginning with obeying their parents. And lest you have any kind of misgivings about the idea of putting your little children on an agenda which has this point to it, that they're learning to obey me, let me remind you as a second point that training your children to obey you is teaching them to obey God. In teaching them to obey you, you are teaching them to obey God. First, literally, in that they are, as children, under orders from the Bible to obey you. So you're literally teaching them to obey a commandment of God because they are commanded as children to obey their parents. That's Ephesians chapter 6:1, which says, "Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right." It goes beyond that as well, but that's the first point. That since they have been instructed to obey you, as you train them to obey you, you're training them to obey God. Sooner or later, in the process of raising children, you parents don't need me to tell you this, sooner or later in the process of teaching them to obey, they will ask you, why? We hope that they ask it in the most humble and lovable way. If they don't answer the question just then. But the question deserves an answer. Why should I obey you? Is the question that comes to every child's mind eventually. And the answer is provided for us in Ephesians chapter 6, verse 1. Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. So parents are to teach your children to obey them. And the child asks why, and whether it's right to answer the question just then or not. The answer is because it's right. It's right to obey your parents, because God made it right. God said so. Train your child to obey you is teaching them to obey God. But besides the fact that it is a literal commandment, children, obey your parents, and you're teaching them to do that as you teach them to obey you. Teaching them to obey you in a broader sense teaches them or sets them up to obey God. Because you see, as children and as your children and as people who as the ones who have inherited all of your own independence and rebellion, they're not particularly disposed to obey God. And you've got to bring them online and show them how to become people who obey God. The problem is, you see, born as we are, born as our children are, in a state of willful disobedience, we are born with the false impression that we ourselves are the center of the universe. And part of raising children is to teach them that, in fact, they're not the center of the universe, and the world doesn't revolve around them. And they are important because they're people, but they're just one of 5 billion people in the world. They have a place, but it's not at the center of all things. You know, historically speaking, the human race suffered from the same sort of misconception. And then there was a man named Copernicus, who once and for all set the world straight and explained to the people of the world that the world itself was not at the center of the universe. Up until that time, people generally took what is called a geocentric view of the universe. That is, they thought the earth was in the middle of everything. And of course, they go on from that to think that they themselves are the one in the middle of the whole world. But never mind that, the world is at the center of everything. And they went on appearances, and they went on feelings. They said, well, the sun pretty obviously is going around us, and the moon is going around us, and all the stars are going around us, so we're pretty clearly the center of all things. And that's a parallel to how children are born thinking that they themselves are the most important ones in the family. You ever notice that? That's what they think. And then Copernicus came along. He was actually a physician, a Polish physician who lived around the year 1500. And he wrote a book which, in translation, the title means The Revolution, of a Revolution. And he talked in revolutionary terms about the fact that that the universe did not revolve or rotate around the world, but rather the world rotated around the sun. He changed the geocentric view of the universe for a heliocentric view of the solar system. Here's what he said. It's pretty interesting for us as we consider parents. He pictured the solar system this way. In the middle of all, he says, in the middle of all sits the sun on his throne, as upon a royal dais, ruling his children, the planets, which circle about him. So he gave us the analogy which is helpful to us as parents. He pictured the sun, S-U-N, the sun, as a king sitting on a throne with all of his children, the princes and princesses, revolving around him. And what we're being told here, for our purposes, is that children who think they are the center of the universe have to learn to center their attention upon their parents. They have to grow up to take on the status of a planet in orbit around the sun. And ideally, husband and wife working together as one are the sun, and the children get ordered around into an orbit around them. So the children are born thinking, I'm the important one here, I'm the center of the universe, and you have to teach your children, no, that's not actually true. In our household, actually, the parents are the important ones. You obey us You follow our orders and all will go well. And you say that with warm affection in your voice because you know it's the loving thing to teach them. And if all goes well, you develop a household in which the parents are at the center and the children rotate around, revolve around. Now what happens in an ideal situation is that the parents give off, by the example they set, another impression. And that is that while the children are rightly centered upon them, they are not centered on themselves, but they as planets are centered on the Son, the S-O-N Son, the Lord Jesus Christ, who really is at the center of all things. So the parents aren't really like the sun, the parents are like the earth. And the children are not like planets, the children are like the moon. And so the children revolve around the planet as the planet revolves around the sun. And your goal for your children is, first of all, to bring them in an orbit around you, teach them to obey you, teach them to center upon you. See, this is going to be really good because eventually they're going to spin out of orbit, they go off to college, and there are you. There you are all by yourself. And if you were revolving around them, then when they go off to college, you're spinning around no one. And you've got a big hole in the middle of your life, and your life resembles a donut with nothing in the middle. But if they were revolving around you, see that you're still there, and you're the center, and you're not off balance. And the empty nest actually comes as a welcome relief. So then you're going around the sun, you see, and your goal for your children is not just to make them moons or satellites that orbit around you, but eventually to get them to the point where they grow up to come out of orbit, stop centering their lives on you, but continue to center their lives on God. So they don't spin off into space, but they take up their place and they center their lives on Jesus Christ as well. And that's your goal. So you have on your agenda for your children a necessary Copernican revolution. You've got to teach them to abandon their geocentricity, their egocentricity, the idea that they are at the center of all things. You've got to teach them to center upon you as their loving authority, to prepare them for the point where they will cease to obey you. They continue to honor you, for we're all under the commandment to honor your father and mother, but only children are under commandment to obey their fathers and mothers. They cease to obey you as they cease to be children, but they follow your example. They follow your path, and they orbit around the Lord Jesus Christ. They orbit around God as they have learned from you to orbit around God. And when that happens, as you bring your children into control, as you teach them to center their lives on you and to focus upon you and to obey you, to become parent-centered children, you're not only preparing them for the future, preparing them to look to God as their Father and to center their lives upon Him, but you're also settling your home into a harmonious and happy place. And of course that's what you want, because the alternative is alarming and very uncomfortable. I hope you have in your recollection some examples to follow. Ideally, you'd have your own household as an example, and you just remember as young parents what your parents did for you when you were young children, and you imitate them. Of course, no earthly example is perfect, so it's good to compare notes and to look at other examples. And we can look at other examples in our own neighborhoods, in our own extended families, and we can look at other examples in history as well. And along those lines, I'd like to read to you a couple of sentences from an eyewitness account of what would be called these days a highly functional family. In other words, a very happy home. It's the home of Jonathan and Sarah Edwards. Jonathan Edwards was a preacher, pastor, living in the early 1700s in Massachusetts. And besides being a busy pastor, he was the father of 11 children. He had 3 sons and 8 daughters, and they were remarkably, some would say miraculously, well-behaved. And not only well-behaved, but they were remarkably respectful of their parents. And a young man that came and lived with him for a while, as he was studying for the ministry, had opportunity to observe up close how happy a mother Sarah Edwards was. And he saw that it had a lot to do with the control that she exercised over her children. Not only that she exercised great control, but how she exercised control. Let me read to you a couple of words from his account of this home. And you try to imagine the changes involved in your child raising and the changes to your home that would come about by following Sarah Edwards' example. This eyewitness says, she had an excellent way of governing her children. She knew how to make them regard and obey her cheerfully, without loud, angry words, much less heavy blows. She seldom punished them, and in speaking to them, used gentle and pleasant words. If any correction was necessary, she did not administer it in a passion, and when she had occasion to reprove and rebuke, she would do it in just a few words, without warmth and noise. I think we would say with warmth, without heat and noise, and with all calmness and gentleness of mind. Now, what did that look like? Well, as the children grew up, it looked remarkable. Listen to this. She had need to speak but once. She was cheerfully obeyed. Murmuring and answering again, talking back, were unknown among them. In their manners, they were uncommonly respectful to their parents. Here's 11 children, 3 boys, 8 girls. Picture this. When their parents came into the room, they all rose instinctively from their seats and never resumed them until the parents were seated. And when either parent was speaking, no matter with whom they had been conversing, they were all immediately silent and attentive. Sarah Edwards had a system, and this writer says her system of discipline was begun at a very early age, and it was her rule to resist the first exhibition of temper or disobedience in the child, as well as every subsequent exhibition of temper or disobedience, however young, until the child's will was brought into submission to the will of its parents, wisely reflecting that until a child will obey his parents, he can never be brought to obey God. And there's our point this morning. Training your child to obey you is training them, teaching them to obey God. Now let's go on. Mark chapter 12, verse 30 is a commandment to all of us. It says, love the Lord your God with all your heart and soul and mind and strength. God is our Father. What sort of love does he look for from us, his children? He looks for us to love him with all our heart, with all our soul, with all our mind and all our strength. And that obedience, that respect and love of a child for his heavenly Father is the model, is the prototype upon which our children's obedience is to be grounded. So we can say, point 3, training your children to obey you is teaching them both actions and attitudes. Both actions and attitudes. For our children are to love us with all their hearts so that they can learn to love God with all their hearts. So obedience is not in itself enough, because obedience can be sulky. Obedience must be a matter of action and attitude. So sulky obedience isn't good enough. There are, I think, in child raising 2 battlefields upon which the wars take place. There is the battlefield of action, and there's the battlefield of attitude. And we must understand as parents that our responsibility is to teach our children right attitude as well as right action, to teach them to obey cheerfully as well as to teach them to obey, period. Working on our children's attitude, then, is a part of our job. And you'll know that attitude is a huge issue in terms of how family occasions go. Mother's Day celebrations, for example. You can do all the right things, but if your attitude stinks, it's not going to be a very happy afternoon for mother or anyone else. And we need to help our children with right attitudes. My wife used to say there's 2 types of children in the world. There's old boy kids and there's old brother kids. The old boy kids are enthusiastic, and when told to do something, they say, oh boy, and they do it. And the kids you don't want are the old brother kids who are told to do something, and they may or may not do it, but they say, oh brother. And old boy kids and old brother kids grow up to be teenagers, either all right teenagers or oh right teenagers. They either say, all right, when they're given something to do, or they say, oh right, when they're given something to do. And we want to work on our attitude, which is a matter of instructing our children how to have a right attitude. It's a matter of giving them the script. It's a matter of giving them things to say so that they know what a good attitude is like. I remember once coming home when my firstborn was very young, and she was just learning to talk, and their mother was working on her attitude. And I suggested that she do something, whether put her shoes away or tidy this up or do something. And she said dutifully, Ness, let's. And I never heard of that before. She said, Ness, let's. So I said, what's that? And she said, Mom's teaching me that when I'm to do what I'm told, I'm always to say, Ness, let's. And she had no concept of what she was being asked to do, but she was taught to say it. Well, what she was being taught to say really was, yes, let's, which is like an oh boy kind of thing. It had no meaning to her. The point is, it didn't need to have meaning. It was simply the script she was given. It was simply the line she was given. She was told, in no uncertain terms, when I tell you to do something, you must do it, and you must do it with a smile. Say, yes, let's, or Ness, let's, as it is translated. The question is, how do you insist upon attitude? A lot of parenting goes off the rails here because it is concluded logically but wrongly that you can't mandate attitude. He can't help it, he just feels bad, so I've got to let him sulk. But that's not true. We grow up to be people who choose our attitudes. Whether we know it or not, we're choosing to be kind, we're choosing to be happy, or we're choosing not to be. So we have to teach our children to take control of their attitudes. And I would suggest that the way that you do it is our lessons learned from the baseball park. How do you teach your child an attitude, a right attitude? On the one hand, by being a fan of theirs whenever they do well. So if they obey or respond or comply or come along with a good attitude, you be a big fan of theirs. Like a baseball fan, you say, whoa, that's great. good attitude there. You applaud their good attitude. And this is what's ideal about having two parents. The one parent, in the hearing of the children, can brag to the other parent, not only that he or she did the right thing, but that he or she did it with the right attitude. And if they hear lots of positive reinforcement, it will cheer them on to have a right attitude as well as right action. And then also from the baseball park, when your child is a person of bad attitude, then you don't act like a fan and cheer them on, and you don't boo them, which would not be polite, but you act like an umpire. And you say what umpires say when players have bad attitudes. You say, "You're out of here." And what I would suggest you do is, rather than treating bad attitude in the first place like deliberate disobedience and then dealing with it as you deal with deliberate disobedience, rather treat it as something that doesn't belong here. And so you temporarily banish your child from the family. So you can imagine that in the family room, you're all trying to play Monopoly or some other, family activity, and one kid's just got a rotten attitude. So you ask him to correct it. You say, "Yes, let's." And if he won't change his attitude, then he's out of there. You send him to his room, and you make him sit on his bed. Now, the whole thing goes awry if his room is equipped with television, VCR, computer games, and all that sort of stuff. That won't work. So that's another argument against all that stuff in the bedroom. The bedroom needs to be sort of sparsely decorated with just the essentials, a dresser and a bed. It also needs to be that the family is a happy unit, so that being banished from the family is not a welcome relief, but actually a form of punishment. And then the child is sent to his bed, and he's told, I can tell you from our own experience this works, he's told, you don't come down until you get your attitude under control, until you can be happy. Now, if all goes well, this is a horrible punishment, and the child tearfully goes up to bed, and he's in a bad mood anyway. He started that way. That's what this is about. And he sits up there and he moans and he sulks and he whimpers, and if it gets too loud, then that's deliberate disobedience. You deal with it differently. But if he's just up there being sad, he knows he cannot come down and join this loving, happy, functional family unit until he has a right attitude. And what we used to hear coming down the hallways was, "I'm happy now, Mom! I'm happy now!" And we would say, "No, you're not." And you wait till they get their attitude under control and they can say with a great big phony sound, "Now I'm happy." And you let them come down. And you see, you've taught them something about themselves. You taught them that they can take control of their attitude as well as their action, and indeed they need to. Let's move on. Obedience to authorities is learned by both instruction and example. What you have to teach them, you must teach them by both instruction and example. 1 Thessalonians chapter 2 shows Paul the Apostle in action. He looked upon the Thessalonian Christians, the members of the Thessalonian church, as if they were his children. And he spoke to them about his dealing with them, his parenting of them. And he shows us something about parenting. Notice how he talks about both his example and his instruction in 1 Thessalonians chapter 2, when he says, "You are witnesses, and so is God, how devoutly and uprightly and blamelessly we behaved toward you believers, just as you know how we were exhorting and encouraging and imploring each one of you as a father would his own children." Now, what's noticeable about that sentence as parenting is the second part, the imploring, the encouraging, the exhorting, and that's all the work of a parent. But what needs to be noticed is that he who exhorted and encouraged and implored as a parent would his or her own child is he who was devoutly and uprightly and blamelessly a good example to the children. What will drive your children to despair is if you are consistently a bad example of that behavior and that attitude that you insist upon. What will lead them in the path of life is if you are consistently, you don't have to be perfect at this, but you need to be more or less consistently an example of that which you instruct them in. So we need to be both examples and instructors to our children. And this on every level. Can't emphasize this enough. You have to teach your children what to do, but you have to be an example of it first. On all the big issues of life, obey the Ten Commandments, and all the small issues of life, like how to answer the telephone. Your children will not naturally turn into polite little people. It's got to be scripted. They've got to be told how to do it, and you have to show them first. So in our household, for example, we insist that our children give their names when they answer the phone, because from our frame of mind, it's rude not to. So we make them answer the phone by saying, "Hello, it's," and they give their name. But you see, if we had insisted that they do that and didn't do it ourselves, they would think of giving your name when you answer the phone as kid stuff. Not what parents do, just what kids do. And they would look forward to the day when they cease to be children and they could just say hello like their parents. So from the very beginning, my wife and I made a point of giving our names when we answer the phone so that they see it's not kid stuff, it's family stuff. It's what the Wilkins do. We always give our names when we answer the phone. And similarly with every other tricky part of a phone conversation. You have to teach them how to do it. What to say to a person when it's a wrong number. What to say to a person when there's no one by that name here at this address. What to say to that person if they got the right number but the person's not home. Can I take a message, and so on. And again, if you teach it to them, they'll know how to do it. But if you don't do it yourself, they'll think it's kid stuff rather than family stuff, and they'll drop it when they get to be feeling that they are adults. And in your example, you must remember that it's both action and attitude. It's one thing to teach your child a right attitude towards their authorities, you yourself. But if you do not demonstrate to them by example a proper attitude towards your authorities, you'll train them inadvertently that politeness and respect towards authorities is kid stuff, not family stuff. So you teach them to obey you and honor you as you should. But if you disobey and dishonor your authorities, if they hear you constantly criticizing the civic government and church leaders and every other authority in your life, they will learn that children are to be respectful, but adults can be as disrespectful as they feel like. Obedience to authorities is learned by both instruction and example. We must be examples of right attitude as well as right behavior. Now, finally, and I remind you of the initial point, how can you be a happy mother? How can a happy Mother's Day be part of life? You will be a happy mother if your children are happy children. And you will be a good, righteous, happy mother if your children are good and happy and righteous. Now, how are you going to make your children happy? Well, here's the final point. And it comes to us from the words of the Lord spoken to his apostles the night he was betrayed, John chapter 15, verses 10 and 11. Here's what he said to his followers. If you keep my commandments, you will abide in my love, just as I have kept my Father's commandments and abide in his love. These things I have spoken to you, that my joy may be in you, and that your joy may be made full. These things I have spoken to you, that my joy may be in you, and that your joy may be full. What things? The commandments. The point is, obeying God is the path to happiness. The point on the sheet is, learning to obey our authorities is learning a source of lasting joy. Learning to obey our authorities is learning a source of lasting joy. That is, there is a special sort of permanent joy in obedience, which we make our children happy by training them in. Now, our children will get from their friends and from their own feelings all sorts of strange and destructive ideas about what will make them happy. And they may spend the rest of their lives pursuing their happiness in self-destructive behavior because they've been taught the way to be happy is to do that or that or that. But in actual fact, the way to be happy is to obey God. Your joy will be full as it is found in obeying God. So as you teach them to obey you, which is a commandment that they are under, and set them up to learn to obey God, which eventually will be, who eventually will be their heavenly Father, you are teaching them a source of joy which they will never need to do without. So that whatever circumstances their lives are surrounded by, whatever becomes of them circumstantially, they will always have this lasting joy within them. The joy that comes from knowing that they're pleasing their Father who is in heaven. I hope you can see it in your children. They're happiest when they're being obedient on purpose. And they're living their day basking in your approval. That's what God means for us to do. To grow up, to be obeying him, happily obeying him, and finding in his approval our great joy. If you want to be a happy mother or a happy father, you're going to need to orchestrate, to the degree that you can, your children's happiness. For you know you love them too much to have it any other way. You can't be happy if they're not happy. But the happiness you want to invest them with, to direct them towards, is the happiness that they can have the rest of their lives, whatever their circumstances are. The happiness of knowing that they are obeying God. And as they are happy, with that sort of happiness, it will make you happy. And everyone, on Mother's Day and Father's Day and all year long, will have a happiness that comes from knowing that we're on the path that leads to life and to joy. So the Proverbs say, correct your child, and he will give you comfort. He will delight your soul. And my prayer for each of us who are parents, and each of us who one day will be parents, is that our souls will experience the unique delight that comes from seeing our children grow up in the correction and instruction of the Lord to be people who look to God as their Father and live with His happy approval day to day through their faithful obedience. So go ahead, do your work with attitude and action, by example and instruction. Correct your child. Teach your child to obey you. And one day he will give you comfort. One day he or she will delight your soul.